So thank you for joining us, Jeremy. It is a pleasure. It was a pleasure talking to you the last time as well. I mentioned that I learned a lot of things from you the last time itself, and today we are finally recording this for everybody. I'm gonna try and do a quick intro for somebody in your position. It's very difficult to give a very serious intro because I'm not able to articulate everything that you've done over the last, I don't know, 30, 35 years of your career. But I will try to sum it up by saying that in everything that I have seen on your profile and that we spoke about last time, you have continuously been in a position of storytelling, telling the right story, and trying to ask the difficult questions. So it is very interesting. Your career transition has been very interesting to me, from being a TV reporter and a journalist for over 20 years to handling crisis comms to now learning AI and logistics and now running a one-man show for a fairly large startup in the US in supply chain. So amazing, amazing as a journey. Let's start with your side of the story. How would you describe your story has been so far, and how would you what led you to the point that you are at right now?
Well, thanks for that introduction. That was very kind. From my perspective, from the very beginning, I've always just been most interested in finding and telling those stories that can have real impact on people in their lives, whether they necessarily realize it or not. Sometimes, right? So that's why I started my career as a television reporter in several markets across the US. Ended up down here in Houston, Texas, which is one of the top 10 US TV markets, and seems like it's one of those cities that every story seems to have a connection to one way or the other, with the world's largest medical center and a significant, obviously, global oil and gas presence and tech presence and all of that. There's kind of a little bit of everything that flows through Houston. And when media started changing and shifting, trying to find its way in the transition into the new world of digital delivery and traditional media kind of beginning to fall by the wayside and needing to make those transitions. One of the things that happened specifically with local news is it became just a slaughterhouse effect of, here's the murder du jour and the fiery car crash and all these sorts of things that really, while often they're sad and they're tragic for the people involved, bigger picture, they don't really have a significant impact on the lives of folks. And so the ability to find and tell those stories diminished
Right.
completely. So, I was looking for other opportunities, ended up moving into a major energy company. This was based here in Houston and handling my first run at corporate communication and marketing and PR for a business unit in the car EV charging network market, and worked really early on with that company to build out its market presence across the country. Learned a lot there, and was asked then by the state of Texas to be director of communications and chief spokesperson for the Department of Criminal Justice, which is the largest non-federal prison system in the US, and corrections, and has plenty of crisis communication experience to be had at an agency like that. Then moved into the agency side and did crisis comm and reputation work for a range of clients, working for Edelman, and have recently, about a little over 6 months ago now, transitioned to Bot Auto, which is a up and coming startup in the autonomous trucking industry. We had some big announcements earlier this week where we showed folks our first, what we're calling Humanless validation testing run, which literally means, unlike others in this space, we were doing that operation with no human being whatsoever in the vehicle, no backup safety human that others have and still use, and we do too. But the point of this validation is to show that humanless is not only possible, it's safe and here already, basically. So we formally released that this week, and feedback has been great. And we continue on that journey to um, fully autonomous truck innovation, and hopefully we'll change the face of logistics.
That's awesome. Congratulations to all you guys. Um,
Thank you.
the interesting thing that you mentioned was the humanless sort of a thing. And from a trucking company perspective, that's in autonomous vehicles, that's not very interesting. But what is interesting is the role of how you are sort of associated with that humanless thing. And this was my interpretation, by the way, from our last conversation. You are close to, I mean, you're a one-man show running everything, marketing for Bot Auto. That's close to humanless, if you ask me.
Ah,
So, how would you describe your role, and how is technology playing a part in enabling you?
well, we're well covered on the high level strategic side, right? Like
Mhm.
I work very closely with our vice president of business development and our chief policy officer and all of those folks to you know build out conceptually what it is that we want to do. The application of it is where it becomes more of a one man band sort of scenario. And you know, I don't believe that it would have been possible even 3 or 4 years ago to
Mm,
be as productive as a single person or even a small team can be using the tools that are now at our fingertips, whether that's, generative AI and LLM models to, help do what in the past would have taken an entire team of, junior associates at an agency writing press releases or social media posts or those sorts of things, and then passing them up the chain to be, reviewed by the strategists and the mid-level and senior folks. Um, well, now at least some of that groundwork, that first pen sort of groundwork, can be done quickly by utilizing your own material that you've been creating from the beginning so that it maintains some level of tone and clarity, and then it's then stepping into that senior role and doing the proofreading and the fine tuning and the wordsmithing and all of that sort of thing. But it significantly increases the volume that you're able to do, right? Like if you had a full communications team at a company, even a small company, you'd have someone who's focused, at least someone, if not a team of people that focused only on social media
mm,
and planning and strategy and content creation and all of those sorts of elements, and another team and or person entirely that's focused on media engagement and press release writing and all of those sorts of things, and then still others that are looking at strategy, and still others beyond that that are working on more visual content and all of those sorts of things. So thanks to technology, we're able to have a significantly higher volume of material, which serves the purpose of spreading the message of bot auto.
got it. And then in that case, what would you say? Because you end up doing so many things within marketing as an area or media. What would you say consumes a lot of your time comparatively? Because you
I would
end up.
say my philosophy in all of this,
Mhm.
in working with either small teams or limited resources, is pretty simple, and that is sometimes it can be better because you tend to work smarter, not harder,
Mm,
where you may plan a project from a strategic level
mhm,
differently because you're not looking at it as a singular blog piece or a singular thought leadership piece or a singular video
mm.
piece. You're looking at it collectively as all of the above.
Right.
And if you plan it that way, when you do your interviews with executives or whomever you're doing the story about, you're
Mhm.
gathering the material for all of the above
Mm.
and only doing it once, as
Right.
opposed to somebody having to take time out and do a meeting for a blog post and then turn around 2 weeks later and carve out an hour out of their calendar to sit down and do a video interview or something like that.
Right.
If you have it strategically planned what all of those elements are going to look like and need to filter out of that,
Mm.
then you're saving a significant amount of time at the end of the day, not just for, your communications or marketing people, but for your executives.
Right. Interesting. So if you look at what Auto as a company and its vision, right, would you say that that's part of your culture now to, I mean, to think that an autonomous vehicle company would have departments that run on their own of sorts? Do you think it's part of culture now? Or is it too early to say AI is still not there yet?
No, I think that it's absolutely not only cultural, it's intentional, and it's been built that way for a purpose.
Mm,
And what I mean by that is, one of the things that we continually hear in conversations, or for example, from journalists, and other feedback from our announcement this week about our humanless operation,
mm,
validation, um, is, well, how we don't know, why is it that you've been able to do what you've been able to do in just under 2 years as a
mm.
company, as
Right.
opposed to others who have been in the space for nearly a decade and have, significant capitalization and money being spent. But now here you are in essentially the same place, if not better position than they are in such a short period of time. Well, philosophically, that is comes from the top down from Xiaodi Ho, our founder and CEO, who is a firm believer in it's the scrappiness of a company that allows it to succeed.
Mm,
So, while some of our competition has literally thousands of employees doing all of the things that they're doing, we have less than 80.
right.
And that includes everything from the engineers to the technicians to the, commercial driver's licensed drivers who do, the driving of the trucks from the safety driver perspective and all of that.
Mm,
Which allows you to be much more intentful, let's
mm,
say,
mm.
in how you use your capital and the capital that you need to get to the milestones that you need to get to. Um, so yeah, and that only happens because of that exponential increase in both computing power and AI modeling and large language models and all of the things that aid, like, we're a really interesting microcosm, I think,
Mhm.
of the application of technology across a business.
Right.
Um, that's how you do what we've done with 80 people in less than 2 years, because
Right.
of the amplification of what you're able to do thanks to the AI and the large language models, whether that comes to being able to, run simulation within the foundation model that forms the base of how the trucks think, to, writing social media posts and those sorts of things. It's a systemic desire to be scrappy and smart about everything that we do.
Got it. Can you give us the different scrappy departments of Bot Auto? How is the company structured? Because it seems like it's not how it would traditionally be structured. It feels like it's more interlinked and one person given more responsibility and more autonomy to be able to do their job than more traditional larger organizations would
Well,
have.
I would say that it's pretty typical
Okay.
for the organizational structure of a startup,
Hmm.
where you're almost always going to be leaner and have more broad sort of job descriptions, whether from the executive level or the management level on down.
Hmm.
For us, we have our chief policy officer who handles government relations, safety, all of those sorts of items that require those sorts of interactions with that particular set of stakeholders. We have our finance and strategy officer, who obviously handles the elements of fundraising and those sorts of business strategies and how the financial planning of the company moves forward. And then we have the, operations, which is the engineers doing the research and writing the code, and the technicians who are retrofitting the trucks, and the drivers who are driving them, as we continue down that validation journey. We see this entire journey as something, um, to kind of torture a metaphor. It's sort of that never-ending road, right? Where you're in a state of
Hmm.
continuous validation, right? You don't run a test
Right.
here or a test there. Literally and that's, I think, an upside to autonomous vehicles is literally everything you do is making you smarter and better. And by
Correct.
you, I mean the foundation model and the way that the truck thinks and the way that it has experienced things and all of that that plays into how it calculates what it is and is not going to do through any of its various redundancies, of which there are obviously many, right? Because that's the challenge
Right.
when you're talking about the concept of humanless versus driverless, right?
Right.
It's the humanless that allows you to be a viable business model because
Mm.
the largest cost involved with the operation of a commercial truck, with a commercial vehicle, is the cost of the driver.
Correct.
And if you're able to fully eliminate that driver, that's what's going to get your cost per mile advantage, which is really the only thing that matters, right? To the
Right.
customer who is the shipper, they care about reliability and cost. And so
Correct.
for us, philosophically, it's a matter of when you are able to get your cost per mile, our cost per
Mm.
mile, to a level that's equal to or less than human,
Mm.
that question answers itself about your
Correct.
viability in a current atmosphere in trucking and transportation where there's a shortage of commercial drivers, as
Mm.
high as 100,000 of them, depending on which sources
Mm.
you listen to, and a
Mm.
lack of capacity, especially for the types of runs that we're solving, that we are, you know, focused on, which is those middle mile, hub to hub, long haul sort of routes over time. And you start with one between Houston and San Antonio, and build and build and build until you're able to go from Houston to Los Angeles in 19 hours because your drivers don't need to stop. And then
Right.
it's a very different world as far as how that cost per mile calculates and translates to the customer.
Right. I think we touched upon this in some of the things that you said, but I want to make that more explicit. I could relate to it because of the conversation that we had last week. But if you could talk more about the cost that you started with and how you ended up bringing that down in 2 years, the cost per mile, because that is really the most important thing, right? And can you talk about the innovations that led you to, I think the cost is one fourth or one fifth of what you started with, and
Sure.
that is industry standard right now. So you can do a lot more. So you touch based on what all you have accomplished in the last 2 years. I think it would be
Mhm.
fun to just explicitly mention the numbers for all our execs.
Sure. So, one of the things that I think is important to keep in mind that the concept of cost per mile is obviously one that's well known within the transportation industry with, human drivers and everything else is what's your total cost per mile. If you take into account everything,
Correct.
maintenance and fuel and driver and upkeep and acquisition of vehicles and all of those sorts of things. You
Yeah.
calculate that all together. What people don't necessarily agree on is how that translates to the autonomous space
Mhm.
or how to calculate it. So about a month and a half ago, about 6 weeks ago, Boston Consulting Group published a white paper about the ins and outs of cost per mile, why it's important, and how um, all companies should have a common, auditable, comparable system for calculating cost per mile. Because obviously, the cost per mile between a company that is in a startup phase or has less invested in the R&D side of it.
Mm.
Let me rephrase that. From our perspective, the R&D side of it is something that should be considered when you're talking about your cost per mile, right?
Right.
When we started our cost per mile, because we were doing validations, um, and always with the driver was much higher because you have to add in all of those different costs. We're talking in the 18 $19 range at the very beginning. But that drops very quickly as you start to streamline and you start to make progress. And right now we're in a position where we're a little under $4 per mile. And depending on who you listen to, source wise, human driver cost per mile cost is in that $2.80 to $2.50 sort of range.
Right.
Um, so that's within striking distance, right? And we believe that we can get there because our business model is to be the trucking company
Mhm.
and handle all of the residual things that come with being an autonomous. trucking company, like sensor maintenance and software continual development, continual validation, all of those things. But being able to consider that all into the model
Mhm.
as you grow the company, we think that it's entirely possible for us to be profitable within 2 years with a fleet of less than 100 trucks.
Right.
And at that point, the cost per mile is equal to or a little less than human. And you have all sorts of different ways that you can market yourselves at that point as far as being, associated. We already had, one of our partner companies already is the logistics and transportation giant JB Hunt here in the US. And um, we do runs through JB Hunt for a company called Steves and Sons out of San Antonio, which is one of the largest door manufacturers in the U.S. Family-owned company that's been around for 6 generations. They were
Right.
building doors during World War I and World War II, and continue to be a family-run business. And they said some very nice things about our partnership in that the way that they've been able to be a 6 generation family-owned now global business is by taking the reins of innovation every time they have the opportunity. And this is just the next step for them.
Right. Interesting. So the cost per mile. So I was talking to an investor the other day for something, and in supply chain they said, the cost per mile is as uh, controversial as your profitability in a startup is. When people say, "Hey, we are a profitable startup," do you really mean you're profitable at EBITDA? Are you profitable at what level of profitability? Are you talking about
Right.
net profitability? Because the variation is so much, and every company will say that, "Hey, our cost per mile is so," but how have you calculated that visibility is not really always there? In such a scenario, how do you look at that as a marketing challenge? Because you being able to communicate that is responsible for bot auto getting more business, right? So how do you tackle that
Mhm.
gray area with great communication? Yeah.
So, there's certainly difficulty if you're trying to do that without some level of third-party validation.
Right.
And that's what BCG's framework provides
Right.
when it comes to cost per mile, is a third-party validated way to audit, to
Hmm.
put everyone on the same playing field using the same information to calculate that cost per mile and make it something that's synonymous to all companies in the space, as opposed to everybody just throwing their numbers together however their formulas happen to work, choosing to consider or not consider certain elements financially that could impact cost per mile. So we're choosing to follow explicitly BCG's framework
Methodology.
and
Yeah.
calculations in order to be able to say, look, these, yes, they're our numbers, but
Yeah.
this is how a globally respected third party in finance and business operations suggests that it should be done. So here you go. I mean, we don't have anything to hide. We pride ourselves on transparency. That's why we released all of the video that we released of the completely empty cabin, leaving no question whether there was a human being in that vehicle or not, as opposed to
Right.
um, leaving it open to interpretation, let's say.
Right. Understood. Uh, that poses the other interesting question, which is where your expertise of crisis comms comes into the picture. Typically, when things are going well and everybody's agreeing to a framework, you know, things move on. But if somebody finds a way out, or if there is an alternative that comes out to the BCG framework, how would you handle crisis communications? Because then it would be a matter of pointing fingers and saying, "Hey, it's their framework. We were just using that framework at that point." So, how do you handle such? I'm not sure if you've had to do that right now, but it's interesting to me that you've had your background in crisis comms, which are more difficult than this, and there's sort of that gray area, right? Because you have to rely on a third party. I was a consultant in my previous role, and we used to refer to a lot of these McKinsey reports and a lot of these other reports that consultants would typically give you, and they're great on paper until you start using them, and then you realize, oh, this makes a lot of sense on paper, but it's just not viable. And then your sort of marketing strategy and the communication has to evolve, or deal with the fact that, hey, first we launched and we told that, hey, we will do this. Now we're sort of struggling to achieve that. So how do you balance that?
I wouldn't think that that's even vaguely
Mhm.
a crisis per se, or even a reputational question.
Right.
When you're a fledgling industry as a
Mhm.
whole that is looking for those ways to take diverse sets of corporate goals and ideas of how this business as a whole, autonomous trucking, moves forward,
Mhm.
there needs to be, on some level, some common ground that all of these different companies can play on and use as that specific third-party validation. So, for example, it's not something that hasn't been done before, right?
Mhm.
It happens in every industry.
Right.
For automobiles in the 1950s, nobody knew, cared, or had any idea how to calculate miles per gallon
Right.
because it didn't matter. It wasn't something that came into play. It wasn't until customers began trying to compare companies and which car they should buy or which car they wanted to buy
Mm.
that the standard laid down by a third party validator
Mm.
of miles per gallon became excuse me, became commonplace.
Right.
Because it gives everyone looking at the businesses a chance to compare them on a level playing field. So, for us, there's no risk in calculating cost per mile based on a well-respected third-party validator,
Mhm.
and standing by that.
Awesome. Okay, let me rephrase. What would you classify as a crisis in your
Oh,
situation?
I mean, there are all sorts of potential crises.
Mhm.
Obviously, I think, for example, look no further than Waymo having a accident with one of their vehicles that was no fault of their vehicle whatsoever, and that was shown in the police reports and everything else. Yet the coverage was the big headline:
Mm.
Waymo vehicle involved in fatal crash.
Right.
Uh, and at that point, it's just a matter of managing the scenario, being transparent, being forthcoming,
Mm.
and telling the corporate side of the story, which in
Right.
that case I think they did a very good job in how they managed it. But with any fledgling industry,
Mhm.
even something that people might initially, until they learn more about it, have some trepidation about, like vehicles, moving down the highway with no quote unquote person behind the
Mm.
wheel. But it's a matter of, from my perspective, crisis communication is as much about what you do in advance than
Mm.
what you do during or after a
Got
crisis.
it.
And what I mean by that is educating the public about
Mhm.
the inherent safety advantages of these vehicles, the things that these vehicles can never do that
Mhm.
human drivers do all the time,
Mhm.
like talking on the phone or driving while sleepy or
Mm.
being intoxicated or simply looking down for a second to grab their Diet Coke and looking
Mhm.
up and their world has changed in front of them and having to react.
Right.
These vehicles don't do that because these vehicles are seeing in, for example, our vehicle isn't relying on two eyes or two ears or one brain. Our vehicle is relying on three always operating redundant brains,
Mm.
more than a dozen eyes, with a little LiDAR and radar sprinkled into the top of it to create a full spatial image that people can't have. It's
Right.
impossible for someone driving their car to look
Mhm.
over their shoulder into their blind spot and see 500 meters behind them on their driver's side, there's a vehicle doing 110 miles an hour weaving in and out of traffic.
Right.
And in a very short period of time is going to be right next to you.
Mm.
The truck is able to not only see that,
Yeah.
it's able to instantaneously calculate, okay, what are my outs? What's my best reaction, knowing that that vehicle is likely going to be coming very quickly in a spot where I don't necessarily anticipate it or want it to be. Right. So it's able to make those sorts of analysis and comparisons constantly.
Mm.
And then when you also think about the levels of redundancy in all of
Yeah.
those operations, think of it this way. It's like, if you're a good human, if you're a good
Mhm.
patient, you go and see your doctor once a year and get your physical, get checked out, make sure there's not one of your critical systems that's beginning to fail or anything like that.
Right.
Well, our trucks are essentially getting their annual physical every second,
Right.
but they're not just getting their annual physical from their, you know, normal family doctor care provider.
Yeah.
They're getting their physical from 20 specialists
Right.
every second at the same time. They're cardiologists looking at their heart, they're neurologists looking at
Mhm.
their brain, they're rheumatologists looking at their systems, they're pulmonary therapists looking at their, you know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
literally every single one of those systems, right down to the tire pressure in the trailers,
Hmm.
is analyzed on a constant, consistent basis. And that's just something that human drivers will never be able to do from a safety perspective.
Right. Interesting. That touches base on an interesting point that I had faced myself when I was working with another similar to Waymo, but it was a autonomous vehicle sort of a thing. And what I was trying to help them do is get their consumers to trust that the car is doing its thing. And
Mhm.
so I was on their design end, of course, but I thought a large part of that was also how we were communicating with the consumers, because you use a calculator because you trust that it will give you the right answer. So every machine works on that inherent trust. So
Yeah.
how do you think you can build that trust? What are the inhibitions that you're seeing in people, and how do you think communication and AI is going to play a role in building that trust?
You know, I'm not sure necessarily that it's an AI role in
Hmm.
building that trust. I think it comes down to people's own experience.
Hmm.
And I think that's true of any sort of technological change, right? There are people that said in, the late 1980s that why would people want to carry phones around?
Right.
You know, uh, and now look at the world, right? Um, there are people that were, very fearful during the onset of cellular phones that, oh my
Mhm.
gosh, all of that, energy and electricity is going to cause brain cancer. And we're going to see rates of skyrocketing deaths from people, using the devices that we all have in our hand and are connected to us. So it's not at all unusual when there's a major technological shift for people to have
Mhm.
to really just experience it for themselves and or see it for themselves. I
Right.
guarantee you that there are
Mhm.
hundreds of thousands of folks in the Houston and San Antonio areas with our company, or the Houston to Dallas areas with some others that are also doing piloted runs,
Mhm.
that you've already driven next to an autonomous 18-wheeler
Mm.
and not had any idea that you were.
Right.
Um, and we had it's probably best illustrated. We had an event out at the closed course test track. It's called the Texas Transportation Institute. It's at Texas A&M University in Bryan. Um, so we brought together ourselves and our testing a small-ish, like the fire department that serves that region up there, the EMS service that serves that region up there, and a range of Texas Department of Public Safety state troopers, all together at the Texas Transportation Institute for us to run scenarios and help teach our systems how to interact with emergency vehicles.
Right.
And it was very interesting to talk to the longtime state troopers and
Mm.
the, 27-year veteran rural fire chief about
Right.
how their level of skepticism was high before they actually interacted with and experienced what these vehicles can do. And at the end of the day, the fire chief asked me how soon he could get one
Mm.
because they wanted to be able to drive in the vehicles themselves, right? Which serves that, again, it serves that dual purpose of being able to educate those. And we have constant and consistent outreach to law enforcement, to first responders, to departments of transportation, to government
Mm.
officials, to the general public, even on some level through some of these communications about, here's how these things work.
Mm.
Here's why, they're going well, and you can learn from them. You can learn from them.
Interesting. Um, Now I want to sort of go into details of numbers. We have a section which we call as custom dashboard, and it's a very interesting way to sort of narrow down to the core important things to you in that particular. So if people used to do this on Excel sheets say 10, 15 years ago, but now you'll maybe 5, 6 years ago people moved to building custom software and dashboards of their own. Today an AI will build you the dashboard that you want. So if you have to write three prompts to create your custom dashboard using AI, what would that dashboard show you? If you have to get a visibility of how things are going in terms of health of either communication or company in general, what are the three metrics, or how would you design your custom dashboard?
I think they would be potentially very different
Hmm.
depending on what piece of the puzzle you were wanting to examine.
Okay.
Like in a perfect world, there would be, one that's looking at operational performance
Hmm.
and, safety considerations and
Okay.
vehicle downtime, all of those sorts of things from an operational perspective.
Got
I
it.
think from a communications perspective, I already use um, a couple of different dashboards that
Mhm.
can provide to me um, specific information on reach and audience and tone for both my own social media monitoring of our own posts that we're putting out there, but also how people are talking about us
Hmm.
externally in the external media world. What is their tone? Is it positive, negative? Is it neutral? And being able to measure that. So from a communications perspective, it's kind of that constant battle that you always have where you're looking at internal analysis and external analysis,
Right.
but both of them are equally important. And of course, for a complete big picture look at a company, I would think that the dashboard would include the 30,000 foot view elements of an operational, financial, communication, and even regulation dashboard.
Got it. Awesome. We are on to sort of the last section of the podcast. We're going to do a quick rapid fire with you. I'm going to ask you a fairly simple question. You have to answer in either one word, one phrase, or one sentence, whatever comes to your mind
Okay,
as quickly as possible. Okay. So build a team in-house or buy the capability through an agency.
both.
Okay. Um, One innovation in logistics that you think is overhyped.
Hmm. Come back to that one. That's a good one. I had
Okay.
never thought of that one.
Okay. One underappreciated tool or approach in comms that uses AI.
Um, First draft of anything,
Okay.
for whether that's social media content or press releases or whatever, being able to fine tune your own foundational model to speak from your own voice.
Got it. Um, AI draft or hired writer, which will give you a better ROI?
A hired writer.
Okay. Daily dashboard, yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. One metric that you think companies ignore, but they should track in comms specifically.
Reputation.
Okay. Interesting. How would you track reputation?
Through a combination of all of those things that people are saying about, to, or around you.
Got it. Um, this is more a debatable thing, and I like to have this debate with myself a lot of times. Short form content versus long form content.
If you want people to watch it, short form content. If you want people to learn from it, long form content.
Would you say the same thing about video content versus written storytelling?
Um, I think video content should be original storytelling.
Got it. Um, Public sentiment or technical performance, which matters more for autonomy adoption?
Right now, I think technical performance still, but
Interesting.
that's going to rapidly shift to
Okay.
the other side of that fence.
Okay. On same lines, human driver versus humanless. What would be the biggest public concern to address?
Trepidation of other drivers looking next to them and seeing nobody behind the wheel.
Interesting. Uh, Fast iteration or perfection, which wins in your world?
when it comes to redundancy and it comes to, the truck systems themselves, perfection, because that's the way that it has to be in order for it to be. I mean, you're never going to get a 100% perfect anything, human or mechanical, but you can get as close as you can.
Got it. On similar lines, but the other way, the worst misunderstanding people have about bot auto that you want to rectify through this podcast.
That a nimble, younger company cannot achieve what more established, longer term companies have in a world where there are such rapid technical advances that are happening. A younger, nimble, but experienced company is going to be able to take advantage of those changes in technology and advance just as quickly or more quickly than those that are bogged down by other things.
Awesome. Coming back to the original one that we left out, one innovation in logistics you think is overhyped?
Yeah, I don't know. I really think that I do think that trying to downplay any elements of what has been a decades-long commercial driver's license holder shortage
Hmm.
in the US is is probably the right answer to that. Because there are people that will continue to say that innovation is going to take jobs,
Mm.
when in fact, even under our best possible case scenario modeling,
Hmm.
5 years from now, if bot auto is the massive success, or when bot auto is the massive success that it's intended to be, our best case projections might be able to fill 10-15% of the drivers that are a part of the shortage today.
Mm.
So it would take, 7 major successful companies in the autonomous space to even close that gap.
Right.
Not even suggesting that the shortage is, and the drivers that we would not be replacing, but we would be running those routes, are the ones that traditionally drivers haven't wanted, which are the
Right.
long haul on the road, 5, 6, 7 days at a time away from home, while opening up more routes that are home-based routes, first, last mile routes,
Hmm.
and adding jobs in all of the ecosystem surrounding autonomous trucks that doesn't exist at this point, like monitoring, sensors,
Mm.
maintenance, all of those items, which is of utmost importance, and building out that infrastructure, which is nothing but jobs, jobs, jobs.
Got it. My final one for today, AI for automation and efficiency or AI for generation, content generation?
Efficiency.
Awesome. Good. We are at the end of our time, and thankfully, we were able to close in under the hour. That is awesome. Did you have fun?
Yeah, it was great. Thanks. Good conversation.
Awesome. This was so interesting. A lot of things that we didn't discuss last time also came up. So that was a new way of looking at things. Awesome. Great.